The franchise we know and love had many competitors, and while we love it now, it wasn't always a bestseller. Going from underdog to top of the charts, this is the insane story of Mario Kart. F-Zero. The game sold pretty well, being the 15th most sold NES game with 2.85 million copies sold. It was a success due to the game's high-speed race feeling, the 60 FPS, and the feeling of one mistake could ruin it all, something a lot of racing games back in the 1990s lacked. A year later, after the success, Nintendo wanted a two-player racing game following F-Zero's premise. But the game originally just had a generic racer as the character. However, after messing around with Mario in the car, they brought him in as the racer along with 7 familiar Mario franchise characters after how well Super Mario World had sold. Super Mario Kart was born, and it was a huge success, being the 4th best-selling SNES game with 8.76 million copies sold. Nintendo would go on to make 349 more games for the console, with only 3 games beating it: Super Mario Stars in 1993, Donkey Kong Country in 1994, and Super Mario World in 1991. It wouldn't be until the next Nintendo console that things would change. But what Nintendo didn't know is their rival racing game company Polyphony Digital had just been founded in 1992, and they had started working on a racing game for the PlayStation. Let's jump to 1996 and the Nintendo 64 is released. In the first 3 days of launch, the N64 sold 350,000 out of the 500,000 units. And it's reported that famous people like Matthew Perry and Steven Spielberg contacted Nintendo seeking special treatment to get a console. However, after a strong year of sales, they made some changes to the N64, and due to these changes, they began to fall in sales until they were trailing behind the PlayStation sales numbers. Mario Kart 64 for the console was released 6 months later, after the slowdown sales of the N64. The game still hit an impressive 9.8 million copies, outdoing Super Mario Kart and becoming the new most sold racing game, and being the second best-selling game on the N64. The key difference between the two games is that Mario Kart 64 is 3D, and the look, the track design, they were all so much better, along with the big change from 2 players to now 4 players. Meaning more fun for family and friends, and a big step in the direction of Nintendo's mission statement, to put smiles on faces everyone we touch. Nintendo went from having its foot in the door for being the dominator of racing games with one game, to having the best 2 selling racing games on the market, so clearly a hat-trick would be needed to confirm that they are the best. With all but 3 games for the N64 1997 Christmas release being delayed till early 1998, they needed a Christmas release for the sales to boost. So Diddy Kong Racing got a majority of Nintendo's $200 million advertising budget for the entire year allocated to promoting the game, and it was released on the 31st of October 1997. It sold insanely well. In fact, it held the Guinness World Record for the fastest selling game of the time, with 800,000 copies before Christmas 1997. But the PlayStation also got its own racing game on the 23rd of December 1997, Gran Turismo by Polyphony Digital. This 5-year developed game was released. Now it was a race. Who would beat Mario Kart's 64's 9.8 million copies sold? Would Nintendo get the hat-trick, or would Polyphony Digital swoop in? Diddy Kong Racing broke 1 million copies sold in the United States within 3 weeks of its release. And in its first month on the Japanese market, Gran Turismo sold over 1 million copies. GT showed no signs of stopping, becoming the best sold game in every region it went to, grossing a $58 million revenue by the early 1998. And while Gran Turismo did amazingly, Diddy Kong Racing has slowed down a lot. In 1999, the Milieu Festival in France was held, and Diddy Kong Racing took home a gold prize for revenues above 15 million euros. Whereas GT took home a platinum prize for revenues above 66 million. And while Diddy Kong Racing gained 4.8 million copies, being the 8th most played Nintendo 64 game, Gran Turismo sold 10.85 million copies, not only beating Nintendo's best-selling racing game, but also being the best-selling PlayStation game of all time. So the racing genre now has a new king, Gran Turismo. Following the high success of Gran Turismo, the development team expected the sequel to fly off the shelf, especially as it was coming out in December 1999, just in time for Christmas again. And it did. GT2 sold 250,000 copies in its first week and became the fastest selling game in the UK, while it stayed as the best seller in Japan for 2 months, and in total it sold 9.37 million copies, just staying behind Mario Kart 64. However, the reason for its downfall was it was released with a few glitches. For instance, some players found that the game's max completion percentage was 98.2%. Not being able to get the bar to 100% players were frustrated. Another glitch found that cars disappeared from a player's garage, meaning progress was lost. This definitely impacted sales for the game, but that didn't stop the company from trying a third time. However, while they worked on making the third installment for Gran Turismo, Nintendo worked on their third installment for Mario Kart. Nintendo had just released their latest console, the Game Boy Advance, and it had been selling really well. It sold 500,000 in America within its first week, making it the fastest selling console at the time, and 81,000 in the first week in the UK. So a good reception for the Nintendo's Mario Kart is looking promising. Whereas not so promising, Gran Turismo changed the game's name from Gran Turismo 2000 to GT3 A-Spec, due to the game being delayed from 2000 to 2001. However, on the plus side, the graphics quality looked so much better than the previous 2 games due to it being on the newer console for PlayStation 2. Sony kept the development for the console a secret for 5 years. Even when the press were asking in 1997 about a PlayStation 2, Sony continued to officially deny that a successor was being developed. However, in 1999 it was released, and it came with online multiplayer. The online version hosted a few racing games, like the NASCAR franchise or the Need for Speed franchise, but online play wasn't as powerful as what we know it today. GT3 was the game that released on the GT4 steering wheel made by Logitech, which was definitely a plus. However, what wasn't a plus was the drastic toll that the better graphics quality was doing to the game. GT3 had to cut down a lot of cars, going down to 180 cars rather than 650 in GT2. Whereas GT3 went for better graphics over gameplay, Nintendo went in the opposite way. Mario Kart Advance added new tracks and controls with the new device, but it kept the same player roster while the graphics almost looked like they went a step back, from the N64 with an 8-bit look in this new Mario Kart rather than a 3D look in the N64 version. However, April and July came and went, and with both games now released, there was one clear winner. Mario Kart Super Circuit was the worst for any Mario Kart so far, and wouldn't be able to even beat either Mario Kart games as it only got 5.91 million copies sold, whereas GT3 is the second best selling PS2 game with 14.89 million copies sold, beating GT1, and now GT3 was ahead. Now it was Polyphony Digital's time to try for a hat-trick. But with this failure in mind, Nintendo set out to make their next racing game the best so far. Nintendo's newest console dropped in 2001, the GameCube. It was the first console to not have a Mario game on release since 1983. However, this didn't stop Nintendo from spending $76 million on marketing the GameCube. But the GameCube was fairly cheap. It sold for $199, $100 less than the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. In 2001, a 7-second clip of Mario Kart's next game was shown at E3 2001. But it wouldn't be until 2003 that Mario Kart Double Dash was released. The game released a few new topics. For instance, it's the only game in the series to feature special items dedicated to a character. Double Dash also had 2 characters in one car as well. This meant that the game could either be played by one player switching between throwing items and racing, or 2 players could control one vehicle, one throwing items and the other one racing. While this new game changer didn't stay in the game's franchise, there was one feature that did. A wider range of selection of cars, ranging from a basic Toad Kart to the Battle Buggy. The game also featured 20 characters, a huge jump from Mario Kart's franchise being at 8. The game was released on the 7th of November 2003, and in its first 7 weeks of release, Double Dash sold 1 million units, and Gran Turismo was being delayed for a 2004 release, meaning that the hat-trick for Gran Turismo was a year away, but Nintendo might steal it with this new Mario Kart. But even with Mario Kart Double Dash selling well, it only sold 6.88 million copies, placing it as the 6th best selling racing game so far, and the 2nd based on the GameCube. The issue was that the GameCube hadn't sold as well as the previous consoles, and Nintendo's competition was fierce against Xbox and PlayStation 2. The GameCube only sold 24 million units. There were a few reasons why, but one of the issues was the PS2 featured a DVD reader on the console, and after DVDs were introduced in 1996, the VHS market share declined, and in 2003, DVD rentals surpassed those of VHS in the United States, meaning that the PlayStation 2 was seen as the better console. So with Double Dash flopping, it looked like Gran Turismo 3 was safe with 14.98 million copies, and the franchise would be able to get this hat-trick. That was until 10 days after Double Dash was launched, and a new racing game entered the scene. Need for Speed Underground, which hit 15 million copies, making it the best-selling racing game so far, beating Mario Kart and Gran Turismo copies sold, and it's still Gran Turismo's hat-trick. You see, Electronic Arts have been making the Need for Speed games since 1994, with 6 installments. The highest sales they got were 1.39 million copies. So what changed with this 7th to let them get the 15 million copies sold? Well, it was the first to have a career mode with a storyline in the franchise, and it also had a customization to a really good extent, allowing you to customize a lot on your car. As I mentioned earlier, Need for Speed was available on the PlayStation 2, but it wasn't online on the GameCube, and yes, it was on both platforms. Unlike our other two games, which were either Nintendo or PlayStation exclusive, Need for Speed Underground was sold on the PS2, GameCube, GBA, PC, and Xbox. And that's how they made 15 million copies, by being everywhere while also being a high-end racing game. So with this high from 7 million units sold by mid-2004, they'd already made a start on a sequel. The second game was being worked on for release in 2004. But remember, Gran Turismo had delayed their 2003 release for 2004, so they also had a release. So the Need for Speed Underground 2 resumed its storyline and implemented more customization for the cars, whereas GT3 went from 180 cars to 721 cars in GT4, and when Need for Speed 2 was released, it was pretty positively reviewed. But it didn't meet some criticisms, such as having to drive excessive amounts to get to specific races, bland voice acting, and strong product placement for companies with little to no connotation to auto racing. However, excluding all of that, it stands at 11 million copies sold, being the third best-selling racing game so far, but Gran Turismo still had to be released. 49 days after Need for Speed 2 was released, it came out, and within 3 months it had sold 3 million units in Japan alone. It now stands at 11.76 million copies sold worldwide, being the best-selling racing game that year, but Need for Speed Underground 1 still held the top spot with 15 million copies. However, Electronic Arts were determined to beat it with their next installment of the Need for Speed franchise. So a year later in 2005, they released Need for Speed Most Wanted. It featured more in-depth police chases, but the customization got limited. However, the graphics and quality had once again jumped a significant amount. And like the previous Need for Speed, it was released on a handful of consoles: PS2, GameCube, GBA, PC, Xbox, and the new Nintendo DS. It was released on the 11th of November 2005, and it quickly became a success, making 16 million copies. It would now be the second best-selling racing game. Electronic Arts had done it. After beating their own games record, they're now opened the top 2 spots on the racing genre. Now they had the chance for the hat-trick. But the underdog Nintendo, after 9 years of being pushed to the 6th worst racing game, time for them to release a good seller. So after the release of Need for Speed Most Wanted on the 11th of November 2005, just 3 days later on the 14th of November, they released Mario Kart DS, and it sold insanely well, selling 23 million copies, making Nintendo back in the lead after 9 years. Nintendo's director stressed the importance of Nintendo DS, as 2 consoles ago back in 2001, the GameCube sold pretty underwhelmingly, and he made this statement: "If DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell." Luckily for them, it sold really well, and now is the second best-selling console, only beaten by the PlayStation 2. And while Gran Turismo 5 sold 17.3 million copies in 2010 on the PlayStation 3, making it the second best-selling racing game, beating Need for Speed's Most Wanted with 16 million copies, no franchise came close to beating the sales of Mario Kart DS with 23.60 million copies sold. Well, except Nintendo, with Mario Kart Wii in 2008 selling 36 million copies, Mario Kart 7 in 2011 with 18.92 million copies, and Mario Kart 8 in 2014 with 47 million copies. And that's where the record stands today. An insane story about 3 racing games competing for the top spot. Even though Nintendo hadn't had a good Mario Kart in 9 years, with the GBA and N64 being flops, the Nintendo DS took it home after them trying after failure and perfecting their brand and games. They are now dominating the racing genre, having Mario Kart in the top 4 racing games. From a simple little Super Mario Kart at 8.67 million copies sold over 30 years ago to Mario Kart being the top 15th best selling game franchise with 166 million copies sold. I really think this is a story of perfecting and sticking with your goal. If Nintendo saw the flop of their consoles and all the Mario Kart franchise, then they wouldn't have released some amazing Mario Kart games. So stick with your dream and don't let other people's achievements get you down. If anything, let them inspire you.